Later on in the story, it gets even more that way when he redeems her, when Boaz redeems Ruth, and it lines up so much more, which we'll talk about it when we get there, but how it points to Jesus in so many ways.
Welcome to Guide Through the Bible. Thank you for joining us today for our third episode in our series on the book of Ruth. And I'm joined here today with Arlen Horst, and he's going to be doing the teaching for us.
Happy to be here. Looking at Ruth chapter 2 today, we have another character to learn from. His name is Boaz. The title for today is Be a Boaz. Just be a Boaz. And before we get into Boaz, though, I would like to, again, tie the book of Ruth into the broader picture of the Bible. And, every book of the Bible points to Jesus Christ. And if we have the right set of eyes, we can see him everywhere we look. And today, book of Ruth, no different. We can see shadows and whispers of Jesus if we're aware of this. And so keep that in mind as we go through the lesson today. To say it in a sentence, to summarize it, I would say that today, the thing I want you to take away is about Boaz is this. A godly man changed the world. Go be a godly man. And I'm not saying this also works for women. Like, we're supposed to be godly men, godly women, because Boaz was a man. A godly man changed the world. Go be a godly man.
Amen.
And looking at Ruth chapter 2, we're not going to read the whole passage, I don't think, but I have it. There's 3 sections that it divides nicely into. It's the first 4 verses, and then verses 5 to 13, and then 14 to 17. But all different aspects of Boaz and how we can learn from him and be like him, model our character after his, because he was a godly man and he made a difference. He stood out in a good way. Mm-hmm. And so the first one in Ruth chapter 2 is be honorable. Boaz had a reputation, and we learn of his reputation before we actually meet him.
So did his reputation show up in the first day?
It showed up like in the first verse.
Or is like years of
before. Right.
Yeah, it was probably years of developing that godly character that it showed up.
Right, absolutely. It's not something that you just, invent one day. It precedes you. Your reputation is built over many days. And so he had a reputation, and in verse 1 it alludes to him as a mighty man. Some translations use a mighty man of valor, integrity. He was also well-to-do. He had resources.
This one says a worthy man.
Worthy. Yeah. So he had a reputation, and he was an honorable man. And that's how godly men are. They stand out. And when the society's dark, like it was here in the time of the judges, I believe Boaz stood out. Same is true in our culture. Godly men stand out. Godly women make a difference. They stand out. And the other, it's not mentioned here, but the other thing we know about Boaz is he's mentioned in Matthew chapter 1. And in Matthew chapter 1, it says he comes right after Rahab. It almost looks like Rahab is his mother.
Yeah.
Which I'm not sure. I don't think so because of the time. But it seems like he was familiar with foreign women.
Okay.
Like, it wasn't a strange thing to him. It wasn't weird. He would have, his ancestor, great-great-grandma, like, I don't know how many greats. But I think that played into how he treated Ruth. And that's worthwhile mentioning here at the beginning, because that's something about Boaz that, it was real.
Yeah, and going back to Matthew there, it seems like Matthew picks specific people throughout the genealogy to make up his 14 generations. He's not creating it, but he's shrinking it maybe,
right.
Is the one thought.
Right, that's the one way of looking at it. And there's a passage in 1 Chronicles 6 that mentions genealogy as well. And from the time of Moses to the time of David, there's 18 names.
Okay.
So, there's a lot of time there. And, we don't normally place Boaz right in, like, soon after Jericho.
Right.
Like the conquering of Jericho. And so I don't think Boaz was the son of that Rahab. Maybe there was a Rahab that was his mom, or
maybe
or
it was just a couple of generations in there, and
right.
that made made the point. that
Either
he
way,
was
I'd
a
like
descendant.
I'd like to think of it as Boaz being familiar with a foreign lady in his genealogies, and that was part of his growing up, his story. He knew about it.
Sure.
So he wasn't weirded out by the Moabites. It was like, oh, that's okay. Like, this is normal, somewhat.
Yeah.
And then in verse 2, you have Ruth volunteering to go get food. She's volunteering to get the food, but this is also admitting that she's a poor person. We're poor. And, whatever that is in our culture, signing up for food stamps maybe, going and asking for help. Like, this is her way of like admitting she's poor, and she's going to go do what poor people do, which is glean in the fields.
So you could, maybe in today's culture, it would be going to a soup kitchen or going to a food pantry.
Right.
That would be a similar thing.
Right. Going to the shelter,
Yeah.
maybe in Reading, if it's cold out, the homeless people go to the shelter. It was just their admission in their culture of, we're poor, and this is what poor people do.
Mm-hmm. It was a place to get food when you had nothing.
Right. And it's a neat way of taking care of the poor. If you look in Leviticus 23 and Leviticus 19, like God gives specific instructions for how they were supposed to leave the corners of the fields and leave things for the widows and the orphans and the poor.
That's just what I was going to ask you. Like, what exactly is gleaning? Like, can you explain that a little bit?
Oh, sure. So when they were harvesting, they weren't supposed to totally clean the field. They were supposed to leave the edges, and if some fell on the ground, leave it for the poor people, the orphans, the widows, to come and get their food. And that was God's social security system, if you want to call it that.
Okay.
Like, that was his way of taking care of the poor.
So there was, as you're harvesting, stuff falls and drops. Wasn't it that they specifically, you might even have this here, they weren't supposed to pick up certain things that fall out.
Right.
Like
Just
that
let
was
it
just
there.
supposed to stay there.
Right.
And it took some work. I think even the grape harvest, they weren't supposed to go back and go through and check carefully for everything. They were just supposed to let behind what they missed the first time through.
Which is an admirable way that
Yeah.
God built into the system to take care of the poor.
And so the poor, the idea there is that the poor still had to do something in order to get what they needed.
Right. It wasn't handed to them. There was effort required on their part, which, I think that's wise. It's a good idea.
It's an interesting concept and way to look at it and try to figure out, what does that look like now? Or one of the things that we tend to do is to throw money at it. Like, here's we just put money to it and makes us feel good. We did our part. And here, it almost seems cruel to make them go and get the food or get what they needed out there.
Well, I don't know.
But yet it brought dignity to
Right.
it.
I was going to say it's more dignified this way than some of our ways, I think.
Yeah.
Some of the things we do to help, like this is great. This is good.
Yeah, and so then there was a dignity. I did actually work for this.
Right.
I went and got it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so she goes out, and I like the little phrase in verse 3. In King James, it says, "And her hap was to light on a part of the field belonging to Boaz." And by chance, she came to Boaz's field. It just so happened. That's a nice way of saying it, but God is at work here. There's a bigger story that she's a part of. She doesn't see it now, but hindsight 2020, she saw it. She just so happened. No, this was God leading her and directing her. And the same is true for us. We can say that many times, and I do that. I did that with my life a little bit here. I look back and I say, I just so happened to move to Reading. It was about 2005. And when I moved there, I just so happened to be asked to start teaching. And so I taught school for many years.
Right.
And then, because I was a school teacher, I would look for things to do over the summer. And one summer, I just so happened to be asked to go to teach school in Mexico. To English.
As the most eligible bachelor in
Yeah,
Reading.
I was single at the time. And so I went to Mexico, taught English for that summer. And it just so happened to be in the same school, in the same community where there was a certain Miss Weaver that was teaching English. And so, looking back.
Who is now named Mrs. Horst.
Mrs. Horst. She's a Mrs. Horst now, right. And I met her through teaching school in Mexico, which wouldn't have happened if I wouldn't have been teaching, which wouldn't have happened if I wouldn't have moved to Reading, which wouldn't have happened, this whole string of events. it just so happened. No, absolutely not.
Yeah.
God is in it.
And I think we have a lot of those stories.
Yeah,
too,
why don't you
know.
give us one of your just so happened
Uh,
stories?
So one of the things that I think of that happened along the way is you and I went to school together.
Yeah.
And that has actually, in a way, played together in us being able to know each other, at least somewhat, in this job. And
True.
so when we were in high school together, we had no idea that 20 plus years later, we would work together and sit down and record videos together. You probably would have, yeah, if we would have thought about that back then and be like, yeah, right, whatever.
Right. Right.
But yeah, that's one of those things that just happened to happen, but yet it has built those years and been able to connect again.
Right. It was nice not having to start from zero. Had a little history with each other.
And that backstory.
Right. That's good. Yeah. All right. So yeah, that ends the first section there. We're thinking about Boaz being an honorable man. I'd like to move on to the next section of verses 5 to 13. And here it is, be kind. Just be kind. He was a nice guy. He was really nice. And there's a couple situations that play out in this section of verses that I want to look at. And the idea is that he was a nice guy. He was a godly man. He changed the world, which we can too, be godly men and change our world, if you want to call it that.
One thing that I think of there is he wasn't just nice. Like I've met people who were nice and they had a shell or they had a veneer of pleasantness. But he was actually, like, it went all the way to the bottom.
Yeah.
Like he wasn't just nice on the outside, but he was actually kind and went beyond that.
It was real.
Yeah, it was a real thing.
Yeah. Well, so in verse 5, we see him or interact with him for the first time, or verse 4. He comes to his field, meets his harvesters, talks to them, and then he notices Ruth. And he's like, whose damsel is this? Whose lady is this? Like, he noticed her. She wasn't normally there, and asked about it. It seems like the first impression was a good impression. The foreman of the crew was like, she's been here all morning, been working steadily, and told him who she was. This is Ruth.
But what I noticed is that it's whose, like who owns her.
Oh, interesting.
Almost like he had the impression that she was a slave.
Mm-hmm.
But
and it probably went with with her job, what she was doing.
Okay, out there just picking up and gleaning.
Right.
And it looked like she was, and she wasn't an Israelite, so
right.
All the more reason she may have been a slave.
Yeah, you're right. He does say whose
Yeah.
is she. And I didn't think too much about that. That's a good observation. In verse 8, he has his first conversation with Ruth. And he is telling her and being nice to her, kind to her, which he wouldn't have had to do, but he was, and welcomes her to his fields and welcomes her to stay there. And, he'll protect her. He'll take care of her. It'll be safe here. Mm. He's that kind of man. A godly man has that kind of effect. They're safe. They're protective. And I also think it alludes to the culture around them. Like, it's almost like he didn't quite trust other areas that were, maybe not quite as safe as his fields were. Like, stay here, you'll be all right.
Yeah.
And, that I like that difference in Boaz. And he welcomed her to stay here. As a foreigner, since she was a foreigner, he wouldn't have had to be that nice. He wouldn't have had to, but he did. He was.
That's one of those places where you were saying, be like Boaz.
Be a Boaz.
Be a Boaz, yeah. So that kind of a safe person who is safe even when no one's watching, or safe when it doesn't matter, or
right.
when you could get away with something. He was still, presumably, a safe person then as well.
Absolutely. Boaz had no fears about somebody looking at what he was looking at on his internet history.
Yeah.
Like, he didn't have any worries.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's how godly men are.
Yeah.
The lights are on and the lights are off. We're the same person. Somebody's watching. Nobody's watching. It's the same.
And you can often sense that. I'm sure she could have sensed that. I know some of my daughters and my wife, that they'll sense something just isn't right here.
Yep.
They can't tell you what it is, but
God's way
like,
of protecting women, much more sensitive than you and I. Like they pick up on that much quicker. Yeah. And so she, in verse 9, asks a legitimate question. Actually, sorry, that was verse 10. It's a very valid question. Like he was showing this kindness to her, this being nice to her, and she's like, "Why? What are you doing?" Which is a good question when from her side of the story, like this guy is showing interest in me. What's going on? Why? And he gives the answer to her question is much more information than he got from the foreman. And I think his mind was jogged. Like he remembered the other conversation he was having around the city gate.
Yeah.
Oh, this is that lady that we talked about here. Because he recounts some things that, he heard somewhere.
Yeah.
So the town was talking. The town, this little country town, you get the feel. The gossip was going around.
Sure.
And so he brings that up to her in a conversation in verses 11 through 12. Mm-hmm. And it's not bad things, but it is interesting how he connected this and like, yeah, this is that lady. And he blesses her for what she did and how she made the Lord her God. The interesting thing about this blessing is the phrase at the end. He uses this phrase that, it's almost like a prayer that he prays for her. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, under whose wings you have come to trust. And it's that phrase, it's the exact same words that she says later on in chapter 3, will you spread your wing over me? And I think he got that. Like, oh yeah.
And it's also probably a way for the writer of Ruth, whoever that was, to bring some conjunction to this or bring some like a wrap to this.
Right.
It's
part of a bigger story again.
And I guess that's kind of a picture because there's two wings to it, right?
Mm-hmm. Maybe.
I wanted to back you up a little bit. You said about you said about Boaz being safe. Well, one of the things that he did then was he told his men to leave her alone. And I think that's something else for a safe man will also move to protect
good point.
And try to protect the vulnerable in his presence against even whoever he can in his circle of influence. He moves to protect them as well and put that block there.
In his sphere of influence, more people are safe.
In other words, for his reapers, you're fired if you mess with this woman. Like there was some safety to it. Maybe that's not the kind of terminology he used, but I think that was that idea.
I think he would have done what was needed.
Yeah.
So
I think that's a key point going back to being a Boaz, to be able to do that.
Yeah. And so in verse 13, moving on to her response, she acknowledges his words and receives them, mentioning that she's comforted, like it was meaningful to her. It was a meaningful interaction. And the way it's worded there, it makes you wonder if she didn't have many of those. It's almost like, oh, thank you for that. I was encouraged, but I don't get much of that. And so when I read verse 13, I had to wonder what all she went through at the hands of other Israelites, because I'm sure the others knew she was a foreigner. And if they were making fun of her or putting her down, and here comes a godly man who treats her right, he was being nice. And she is encouraged and comforted and lifted up.
Loved and cared for.
Yeah, when that's a godly man. And, be as Boaz. That's what we want to do. We want to be as Boaz because he was a godly man that changed the world. Mm-hmm. So we can be godly men. You can be godly women and, men. And so moving on to the last section is verses 14 down to 17. And there, I would like to say, be generous. First of all, it was be honorable, be kind, and be generous. So Boaz was a man that held things like this. He wasn't like tight. I got to have it all. Just give me more. It was loose. It was God's, and he gives, he takes. He had that kind of attitude. It seems like from this interaction he had with Ruth.
Kind of that mentality of plenty. There's enough here for all of us.
Right. So in verse 14, he invites her to have lunch with. Come and eat with us, which is, it feels kind of familiar with the come and dine that Jesus says in the New Testament. Not exactly, but you kind of get that impression. There's vinegar and there's bread or wine, maybe. Some translations use.
Says wine, yeah.
And so, there's the invitation to eat, but I also think about godly men and how inviting we are supposed to be. Inviting to our way of life, inviting to our God. And Boaz he seems like he was that kind of man. He was inviting. So he invites her. She comes, eats with them, has some extra, takes it home for Naomi, and gets ready to go out and do her work. And again, we see Boaz. And this is where you get a little suspicious, like, hey, what's going on here? Is this normal?
Yeah.
And maybe it's not. I'm not sure. But he's safe. So it's not dangerous. It's not a weird kind of thing. But he does seem to be showing her a little extra attention. And he tells his reapers, it's okay if let some fall on purpose.
Right. Like, be a little bit sloppy with your work.
Yeah. And kind of taking care of her in that way.
Did they look at him a little funny? Like,
I'm not sure what they thought. I'm not sure what they were thinking. So they go out and, Ruth continues gleaning till it was evening. So while she's getting ready to go home, threshing the barley that she had, she ends up with a ephah of barley.
Well, that's an ephah.
Yeah, an ephah. And that's what I thought. What is an ephah exactly? And I don't know that I can answer exactly what it is, but it's interesting how in Exodus 16, where the children of Israel are eating manna, God tells them that each person can get 1 omer of manna per day. So an omer is about how much one person eats in a day. And, I'm thinking maybe like more than a cup.
One of my growing boys or one of,
Yeah, I know. Maybe a jar. Like, I don't know what we would have that's equal, but an omer was 1/10 of an ephah.
So 10 servings.
Yeah, 10 servings or daily servings, not one meal servings. So that gives you an about.
So that was a bag of flour.
Nice size bag.
Yeah,
nice
size bag.
And we get the impression later on in the chapter that Ruth was like, whoa, who is this? Like, where'd you get that much? Because she was poor. She knew what poor people glean. And Ruth comes back with much more. So it made her ask a bunch of questions.
Possibly 10 times more.
Right. Well, yeah, I don't know how much was normal.
If one day's worth was what Ruth was, or what Naomi was expecting,
yeah,
and she comes back with an ephah, so effectively she came back with maybe 10 times. I'm just making that up, kind of.
It was more than expected by Naomi. But Boaz is generous. It's okay. He's not holding things tightly. He's generous, and he went above what was expected of the law. He had the law which said this, and he does a little more, and a good sign of a godly man.
Mm-hmm.
And then when at the end of chapter 2, when Naomi hears about Boaz, she says, "Oh, he's our kinsman's redeemer."
So she knew who he was.
Right. But she said kinsman's redeemer. And we read that and be like, kinsman's what? What redeemer? And we'll look at this more again next time. The whole thing of a kinsman's redeemer. Because with that word comes a whole understanding of culture. And so I think it'll take a little time to try to understand that word by itself. But before we go, Boaz was honorable, he was kind, and he was generous. Can we be a Boaz?
He lived with his hands open.
Yep.
Yeah.
And one more thing that I mentioned at the beginning is Boaz points to Christ. And here's where we can see the whisperings of Christ. And I like this. I like to think about this. You see, Boaz was in Bethlehem. And we have Jesus coming from Bethlehem. Christ is the Lion of the tribe of Judah. Boaz,
son of David,
was also of the tribe of Judah. And, Boaz was in charge of his reapers, his gleaners. He was the boss. And much like Jesus is. Boaz showed attention to the poor foreigner who became his wife. He didn't know that at this stage. And it's kind of like Jesus paying attention to his people, us, poor foreigners, if you want to call that, sinful people. And later on in the story, it gets even more that way when he redeems her, when Boaz redeems Ruth, and it lines up so much more, which we'll talk about it when we get there, but how it points to Jesus in so many ways. And that's where I'd like to end it with, ending it with Boaz being a type of Christ, but also a model for us, because he didn't know the ramifications of his actions. He didn't know that the Savior would come from his descendants. He was serving God with all he had where he was.
He was serving, he was doing right where he was.
Right. And that's what we can do. We can do right in this moment. We can do right where we're at and change the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, what I take away from it, one of the things that stands out to me in this passage, you said about having open hands or being open with your hands. Well, that actually applies to all of them. Obviously, the generosity and the kindness, but then also not the honorable part isn't having hands that are open for an alternative motive, or an alternate motive. So like an honorable person will have both hands open in a way that isn't, one to grab you and the other to give you something, or
right. It's not sneaky. There's nothing sneaky about it. It's all here and in the open. Yeah, that's good. Interesting point.
Anyway, so I don't know if that gives you a word picture for this passage here, but just the open hands of Boaz.
Yeah.
With it. Thank you for joining us on Guide Through the Bible. I hope that you have enjoyed this episode from our series on the book of Ruth, and I hope that your hands are open